And he just told me this week, he said, what I'd love to do, he says, is practice criminal law for 4 more years and then go out to Wisconsin back to and teach criminal law. My middle daughter went to Hopkins, Mount Holyoke, and then she got a master's in public health from Yale Medical School, and then she got an MD, and she's practicing radiology up at Brigham and Women's Hospital. My oldest daughter, well, I've already told you about. She went to Mount Holyoke, and she went to UConn Law School, and first she practiced with us. She was with us from 1983 to 1992, and then in 1992 she went to Alaska, and she became the managing attorney of the Alaska Legal Services Corporation in the Southeast region, which it ran from Ketchikan to Yakutat, and it was she loved Alaska, and I could tell you 20 stories about her in Alaska, but this is not about her; it's about me. Anyway.
So, you said that you continued all this time in the practice of law because you enjoyed it that much.
I did.
Do you enjoy it any less today than you did 5 decades ago?
Yeah, I'm getting tired. And I don't know if they're gonna, but I'm not that on board with the judicial appointments. I remember that when they used to appoint a judge of the Superior Court, it was generally a person who had experience in private practice. Now they appoint prosecutors and public defenders and clerks, people who've never had to worry about meeting a payroll, never had to worry about hiring people, and I'm not going to say anything further because people will accuse me of being misogynistic, and I don't want to be accused of that. That's already happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, do you ever? The practice of law has changed so much over the course of time, and the practice of law in the digital age has, from my point of view, become increasingly impersonal. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think
moving away from the old style.
There was a time when you did any creative work like briefs or something, there was a lot more personal effort put into it. One of the things is I'm computer illiterate, and one of the things I've become increasingly dependent on is my secretarial help, because I just don't know how to use the computer the way it should be used. And I find that there was a time when you did briefs when you didn't cite any Superior Court cases unless they were printed in the Connecticut, the book that prints the Superior Court decisions. Now, unless you know how to research on the internet, Lexis and Nexus and Westlaw and stuff like that, you can't prepare a case. And I think I'm getting, at 87, I'm a little too old to learn.
Yeah, it occurred to me that one of the focal points of the legal community back before the age of online legal research was the law library. It's a place that obviously John is very familiar with. It was a place where you went to do your research, and everybody else went there to do their research.
I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I still, to today, I still go to the law library for research. Because, in order to keep up the books, it's expensive. It's extraordinarily expensive. And, but, you go to the library, and I find that the library in New Haven, Mrs. Ridley, Astoria Ridley, who's the librarian, and her prior Martha Sullivan,
Yeah.
who lives next door to me. I mean, they're enormously helpful. Enormously helpful.
I'm inclined to interject a point there, you know, irregardless of the shift from books to computers, when you need to use the databases, what the state subscribes to are no cost. You know, so whether you're, and also, you know, for people who are less happy technologically, we're trained to do that. But, you know, when you start talking about the economics of private practice and the cost of Lexis and Westlaw, there's a tremendous differential between what a large firm can afford and a solo or a small and medium-sized firm. And basically, it's the law library which makes the playing field, if not totally level, more level. So just because technology changes doesn't mean that libraries are irrelevant.
No,
And either way you pay.
to me,
That's the other thing. Either the state pays or the law, you know, or the individual pays.
to me, law libraries are I love law libraries, and I do it because this takes you right to the heart of legal problems.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to be able to use the law library to solve legal problems.
Even if it's an electronic law, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
because
that's why I enjoy Mrs. Ridley so much here at the library,
Yeah.
because she's enormously helpful.
Sure.
You know, and she has an assistant. I don't know the name of the assistant, but she's a lovely young woman, and she's just they're wonderful to be around.
What about your notions of the changing nature of the bar membership? You've seen the book as a practitioner, but also on a bar examining committee. And we talked here at one point, there were a lot of sort of legacy lawyers. Your grandfather was a lawyer, your mother was a lawyer. And now I think it's changed a lot. Do you have any observations about just who's practicing law now and how that differs from when you started?
Well, there are a lot more people practicing law now, and there was a time in the 80s and 90s when people went to law school because, I mean, that was the ticket out. When I went to law school, there was one of my professors was a man by the name of Fred Rodell. And Fred Rodell wrote a book called Woe Unto You, Lawyers. And one of the points that he made was the legal profession was a profession where it was a complete meritocracy, that you could start out in your life with very little and make a good life and even a fortune. When I started law school, Yale Law School cost me for tuition, well, $1,450 for 3 years. It was $225 a semester. And to live at the Yale Law School, I recall it was like, for the room, it was like $2,000 a semester. So it was $4,000. And I remember that there was at the Yale Law School, there was two brothers who ran the dining hall, and it was the best food on campus. And they changed the format there. But I remember when we used to have dance weekends at the law school, they used to charge for a buffet dinner $1.25. So you used to have a date up from, and Yale Law School was, I mean, that was the place where Vassar, Bennington, Smith, Mount Holyoke, I mean, all the girls, they used to love to come to the Yale Law School. I mean, you had the best and the brightest there. And I still have friends who survived, and I'm still friendly with the wives of some of them where their husbands have passed away. Anyway, and it's the Yale Law School to me. Remember I said the U.S. Attorney's Office was the Yale Law School was 3 of the best years I ever had in my life. I met my wife between semesters between my second and third year. And I met her. Her mother used to own a resort hotel in the Catskill Mountains. And she used to spend the summers up there. The summer of 1953, I worked in Maine. And I met her in June. And she was dating one of my best friends. And I went to Maine, and I knew that when I was coming back to New Haven, I was probably going to call her. And she told me that the man that she was dating, my best friend, said to her, when you go back to New Haven, I don't want you to go out with Irving. And she said to him, and I'm quoting her, she said, who's Irving? Anyway, I got back to Yale Law School on a Sunday, and I called her from the railroad station. I said, if you pick me up at the railroad station, I'll take you out to dinner. And she said to me, and I quote, I'm not going to pick you up at the railroad station, and you'll still take me out to dinner. That was, did you know my wife? You knew Marcia,
yeah.
Didn't you? That was Marcia, and I took her out. That was the first date we had, and 4 months and 2 weeks from that night, we were standing at the Taft Hotel under the chuppah, which is under the marital canopy, and we were getting married. 4 months and 2 weeks. We became engaged in Harvard-Yale weekend. And I used to take her to class with me on Friday afternoon, because we'd go to dinner and we'd go to the Schubert, or we always went to the Schubert. The only movie we ever saw was Lily when it was at the Crown Theater. And we went ahead, and the class I used to take her to on Friday afternoon was from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock. It was taught by Jerome Frank, United States Circuit Court judge. And she used to love to come there. I mean, it was great. He didn't teach it. The class was called fact finding. And what we did, it was a major bull session. And the week after we became engaged, I came back to school, and she wasn't with me for some reason. And I went over to him and I said, Judge, I said, the pretty little girl I always come to class with? He says, yeah. I said, we became engaged Harvard-Yale weekend. He said, that's terrible. That's terrible. It's the worst thing I ever heard. But it would have been worse if you hadn't become engaged. And I mean, this is what it was like at the Yale Law School. And it was, I don't know what it's like over there now. I know there's one professor that I do know, Judge Calabresi, who was he's really a dear man. And I saw him the day he was sworn into the Second Circuit. It was 60 years from the day that he arrived in the United States. Judge Calabresi's father was a very famous surgeon who left Italy because of Mussolini. And when Judge Calabresi, when his father, I forget his father's name, but his father and his mother were staying at the same nursing home that my mother-in-law was at. And my daughter and his granddaughter, Bianca Calabresi, came. They used to visit. And every time I used to see Judge Calabresi, he would ask two things. One, why didn't Adam apply to Yale Law School? Because he was the dean. And I said, because he went to Wisconsin. And then he said, how was Robin? I remember when she used to visit my parents. Bianca my daughter used to visit her grandmother, and Bianca, and whenever they have lunch, they'd come out and they'd run down to the nursing home, and they'd see them, and then they'd run back to Hopkins.
That's great. So it seems to me that the makeup of the bar is becoming increasingly bland. In other words, there are fewer and fewer characters on the bench and as members of the bar. Judge Chambers was one of those characters, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was the one who tangled with your father.
Well, you remember that.
I remember that very well. Back in those days, there were no secrets. I remember that. I tell a story about your father. It's apocryphal, and Judge Timbers. It never happened, but it's a story I tell anyway. Judge Timbers used to come into court with his dog. He had a dog. It was so I forget the breed of dog. It was like a husky. And Judge Timbers used to say, court's got to start at 10 o'clock. Well, now lawyers would have to be at Superior Court at 10 o'clock back in the old days. So sometimes they couldn't make it in time. And this used to infuriate Timbers, despite the fact that he used to come in after 11. One day, this is the apocryphal part of the story. One day, your father doesn't show up at 10 o'clock. It doesn't show up at 11 o'clock. Timbers comes out at 11:10. Your father shows up at 11:30. And Timbers says to your father, "Where have you been, Mr. Jacobs?" He says, "I fell down a flight of stairs." And Timbers says to him, "This takes an hour and a half?" Apocryphal.
That version is apocryphal, but there is a true version to that story.
I know there was, but I love the apocryphal version better. This takes an hour and a half? No, and when you say the true characters, one of the most marvelous people I've ever known was the probate judge in New Haven, Thomas F. Keyes Jr. And Tom Keyes knew all the stories. He knew all the stories, and no matter how many times he would tell the same story, you'd love to listen to him because he told them so well. Yeah, I mean, there were real characters at the bar, like George Chisaski. Do you remember George Chisaski?
No, I don't.
George Chisaski was a blind lawyer, and he had a seeing eye dog, and he used to bring the dog to court with him, and periodically the dog would bark. And the judge would say, "What was that, miss?" He says, "No, that was not an objection. When the court barks twice, that's an objection." You know, you know, and the lawyer, his partner was George Chisaski. Did I say his partner was George Chisaski, and George was a bona fide character. I mean, he was anyway. Ab was prosecuting one of George Chisaski's clients, and he was appearing before this Yankee judge. And the case was not going well for George Chisaski. And court ended, they used to, the criminal court used to be heard Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Friday was the short calendar, civil short calendar, and the court never sat on Monday back in those days. So the case finishes pretty much on Thursday afternoon, and on Tuesday, George shows up without his client. And the judge, I think it was Judge Inglis, a real straight arrow, he said to Mr. Chisaski, "Where is your client?" He says, "Your Honor, he took sick over the weekend, and he checked himself into Connecticut Valley Hospital." And there was an assistant clerk by the name of Sam Schlein, who was one of the selectmen of the town of New Haven. And he said to the judge, "The problem with that, Judge, is that Chisaski's client checked in the wrong man. Should have checked in George." So Inglis said to him, "Mr. Chisaski, the time is now 10:30. Your client must be in this court no later than 11:30, or I'm going to take steps." So sure enough, he shows up at 11:30. Case finishes. He's duly convicted. And he said to Chisaski, "I want you to be in my chambers tomorrow morning with your counsel." And the name of his counsel was Tony DeLucia. Tony DeLucia was this Italian lawyer who had a marvelous city court practice. And he comes in, and George Chisaski says, you know, "It was not my fault," etc. And Tony DeLucia says to the judge, "Your Honor, it's right, it wasn't his fault. His client checked in the wrong man." He was repeating what Sam Schlein had said. And there were no sanctions, but but Inglis didn't like it. Inglis was a very interesting guy also. Inglis was on the Supreme Court at the same time that Patrick B. O'Sullivan was on the Supreme Court. And they were listening to a case that was being argued by Aaron Nassau. Aaron Nassau was like the Connecticut's expert on real estate law. And P.B. O'Sullivan was he had a great historical background. And they were listening to this argument, and all of a sudden, Aaron Nassau says, and that was the rule that came out of the statute of quia emptores, which was an Old English statute. And P.B. O'Sullivan sits up. All of a sudden, he's very interested. And Judge Inglis leans over to him and says, "Don't try it, Pat. He'll knock you right on your ass." When you say characters of the bar, I mean, these are stories you never forget.
You mentioned the city court. What was the city court?
Prior to 1961, there was like a three-court system in Connecticut. There was city, town, and borough courts. There was a court of common pleas, and then there's the Superior Court, and of course the Supreme Court. The city court, the winning political party in the gubernatorial election appointed the judges, and it was always, like in New Haven, there was always one Irishman, Harold Dunnigan, one Jew, Charlie Henschel, and one Italian. That was, what's his name? Fritz Toscano. There were always three, and they always spread it out. When the Republicans won, there would be three Republican judges of the same ethnic background. And what it did is, it handled the very minor criminal cases. If you lost in the city court, you could take a de novo appeal in the Court of Common Pleas. And then if you lost in the Court of Common Pleas, you had to take an appeal to the Supreme Court. All right. Now, there was a prosecutor in the Court of Common Pleas. There was a case which arose in the Hill section of New Haven, which was heavily Italian. And it was people of the persuasion of the, what's the thing, the Jehovah's Witnesses. They came around and they were proselytizing on the Hill. And sometimes they would get very vehement in their arguments. And finally, one day, they called the people they were proselytizing, called the police, and they were arrested for either trespass or disturbing the peace or something. And they were prosecuted in the city court, and they were convicted. And they took an appeal to the Court of Common Pleas. And there was a jury trial, and I forget the name of the prosecutor in the Court of Common Pleas. They had their own prosecutorial system. They went ahead and they were convicted. And they took an appeal to the Connecticut Supreme Court, and it was affirmed. Then they took an appeal to the United States Supreme Court. I forget the name of the case, but it was like around 1942. And the prosecutor from the Court of Common Pleas went to D.C. to argue the appeal in the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court at that time was made up of what they called the 9 old men. It was the court that existed before Roosevelt started replacing them with people. And one of the members of the court was I forget his name, it'll come to me, but he was an apostate Catholic. Anyway, and James Clark McReynolds. That's who it was. And the prosecutor from the Court of Common Pleas is arguing this case. And James Clark McReynolds was he was kind of a bigot. He refused to have lunch with the rest of because Justice Cardozo was there, and Justice Cardozo's father was one of the Tweed Ring, and he refused to. He says,
One of the Tweed.
Huh?
I'm sorry. Didn't
The
you-
Tweed Ring in New
Yeah.
York. He said, I'm not gonna. He says, I'm not going to eat with the son of a felon. But I think the reason was because Cardozo was Jewish. Anyway, so the justices are peppering the prosecutor with arguments, and all of a sudden, McReynolds says to him, Mr. Prosecutor, is it not a fact that these people who were proselytizing on the Hill were doing nothing more than our Lord Jesus Christ had done back in the days when he had his ministry? And the prosecutor looks at him and he says, yes, Judge, and history records what happened to him. Anyway, that was, you talk about characters at the bench, that was a character at the
Yeah,
bench.
that's funny.
Yeah. And that was one of the stories that Tom Keyes used to tell.
That's funny.
What else do you want to know?
What about advice for young lawyers today? I mean, it's a different and more complicated world, and you've seen a lot of history, you've seen a lot of great cases, you've seen a lot of great lawyering and probably some bad lawyering. And so what would your advice be?
Prepare. No matter what kind of a case you're involved in, prepare it to the nines, because the only way you're going to get respect from the bench is if the judge knows that you're prepared. I've seen judges who have literally taken attorneys apart because they were badly prepared. And when I say prepare, I mean do the research on every possible phase or aspect of your case. One of the things I admired most about Bob Zampano was the fact that he taught me how to prepare cases. And that's the most important thing you can do for your client. Don't worry about the fee. Don't worry about the amount of time you're spending. Worry only whether or not you're going to give your client the best lawyering that there is in you. And always keep your word. Keep your word.